Hi, this is Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. Human beings have been watching the skies for millennia now, and oftentimes what they see give rise to hopes and beliefs and imaginations. My guest today is Dr. Anthony Avini, and he has written about the way celestial sky watching has led to religious thinking, in particular apocalyptic thinking. Welcome, Dr. Avini. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks, Ozzie, for having me on Religion and Life.
Yes, before we start, I just want to run down some of your accomplishments. Feel very fortunate to have you here. You're the Russell Colgate Distinguished University Professor of Astronomy, Anthropology, and Native American Studies at Colgate University, and you've taught there since 1963. Is that correct?
That's
correct.
That's
an incredible tenure.
Yeah. Terribly long time, the only job I ever had.
Well, that's an amazing record. You've written 35 books, over 300 articles, which is an amazing productivity for a professor. And you have experience on TV. You've been on PBS Nova, the Discovery Channel, the Larry King Show. So we feel quite honored to have you here on App TV as well.
Well, I'm honored to be back at App State, and I have my my Mountaineers pin that was given to me the last time I was
here.
Very nice.
And you wear it proudly.
We're bonded.
Well, you've written on diverse topics. And in general, some of your writing has to do with the way human beings have been affected by celestial events or terrestrial catastrophes, and how sometimes that leads to fear or religious imagination. So I'd like to start there. In particular, you've been interested in apocalyptic thinking since 2012. So give us a little capsule summary, if you would, about how you got interested in writing about apocalyptic thinking.
Sure, Ozzie. I'm a man of science, trained as an astronomer. Little did I know, years later, that I'd be talking to somebody who studies religion. It happened largely because of the 2012 experience. Those of your listeners who may be very young might not be aware of the prediction said to have been made by ancient Maya astronomers that the world was going to come to an end on the 21st of December 2012. 2,700 books were written on that. I wrote one of 3 that suggested that the Maya never said that. But the way I got to write the book was interesting. I got an email from a Canadian high school student. And he knew something about my work on Maya calendars, which I'd been doing for some time. I got interested in the Maya world and Maya astronomy at a very early age. He said that he and his friends were quite worried about what they were reading about the world coming to an end. But seriously worried. And when I started to investigate all the emails, and I went on the NASA website, Ask the Astronomer, I read some emails that came from young people, kids in their 15, 16 years old, talking about committing suicide because the world was going to come to an end. Right. So this was not a light matter. To make a long story short, Dylan convinced me to write the book, which I finally wrote. The title was The End of Time, The Maya Mystery of 2012, in which I suggested that what's really going on here, and you have this in many religions, the idea of the end of a cycle. The cycle ends and you have a new beginning. So you go through a purification process, you resolve to start anew and make the world better. And this was what the Maya actually had in mind. I remember a Maya shaman telling me that, you gringos get all worked up about this. We never said that. So what is all this about the gringos getting worked up? Well, after I wrote the book, I found myself getting invited to religion departments to talk about this. And I began to realize that so much of this fear of the end of the world, this millenarian fear, although it's existed throughout civilization, and West and non-West, sure, was really being stoked up very much in the popular culture in America, not in France, not in Europe, not in China, but it was a kind of American fear of the imminent, the fear of the world coming to an end.
Well, in fact,
that was what took me in that direction.
Yeah, and in fact, there were many movies around that time that would piggyback on this. Apocalyptic Anxiety is another of your titles. You wrote a book called Apocalyptic Anxiety. Yeah,
indeed they were, and that's what I was forced then to go back and look at the roots of the American popular culture, right, their romance, if you will, with apocalypse. And really, it does go back to the history of religions, a subject you know well because you teach in that department. But I live in upstate New York. And upstate New York is called the burned over district for a very good reason. Yes. Because during the middle of the 19th century, there were so many religions being founded there that the ground was literally seared with this fervor, emotional fervor about religion. I think it starts really, you go back to the Church of England and the Puritans who leave England because they were a radical sect. They believed in the imminent coming of Jesus as Christ, and they were coming to the New World to find the city of Zion.
So the coming to the New World was a metaphor for God's kingdom, right?
Even Columbus tells us about this in his diaries. I am coming to this world to find the city of Zion, the place where Jesus will come back. And so these the extreme Puritans, as the ones who couldn't even be tolerated in Boston or New Haven, left there and went out the newly built Erie Canal to the ground where I live, in the middle of the state of New York, and then began to practice their own religion there. And there were groups that developed. The Mormon religion was founded there. Palmyra, New York, where Joseph Smith received the tablets, not so far from where I live. The Millerites, the clan, after William Miller, the pastor who calculated the end of the world from biblical calculations, would become the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So all these movements turned into serious religions. But what they had in common was this notion of the imminent end, imminent end. And so I think it's just interesting, speaking as an academic, how you can get drawn into the study of a problem that ends up crossing disciplinary turf. And so you go over to another floorboard in the house of knowledge, if you will, hoping you don't fall into cracks between astronomy and anthropology and religion. And so I remain a student in doing these things.
Well, you straddled all those fields quite nicely.
Thank you.
And still today, a majority of Americans believe in an imminent end of the world, I believe. Is that correct? So there's still this kind of millennial fear, if you will, or anticipation, perhaps?
Well, we heard about it in 1999, didn't we? I remember
we did.
that all the computers were going to stop working.
Right.
I think this is the fear of the unknown. And of course, you get 9/11 on top of that. And now we have a very legitimate fear of terrorism. But again, if you tune in to any news, it's this fear, and we are racked with fear. And maybe some will say, well, we've got a right to be. It's a frightening world. And that's where these astronomical phenomena come in. And I wrote my book about the eclipses in the shadow of the moons, just out with Yale Press, where I talk about this forthcoming eclipse, which is going to be a big deal here in Boone. It'll be 97% total on August the 21st of this year.
Got your book right
here. In Shadow of the Moon.
Advanced copy, I believe.
Yeah,
right?
That's it. Just published this week. So those are galley proofs, actually, but the cover is kind of nice. But it's all about not so much about the science of eclipses, and not about protecting your eyes and how to observe the corona. It's more about how people experienced, how they felt, how they expressed themselves about seeing an eclipse. And most of the expressions, I refer to a word you'll know well, being in religion, the sublime. Sure. Seeing something that's sublime, which, as Edmund Burke, the philosopher, tells us, is a feeling that begins in fear and then gets transformed to a kind of feeling of awe that you could say, if you want to be secular, borders on a religious passion. And I love that word because it straddles that narrow ridge between the slope of objective science on the one hand and the religion on the other.
Right.
And you do have this fear of the unknown. Whenever something comes along that interrupts the usual, a comet, a supernova, an eclipse, darkness in the middle of the day, darkness which we ordinarily fear. The history of humanity, darkness is always associated with fear. You fear, you go in the woods at night and I'll be killed or I'll be robbed. And then, of course, along comes the electric light. Broadway is illuminated by Thomas Edison in the 1880s, and now we can go out at night and do anything we want.
So we in the contemporary world have lost touch with darkness because we can light our world whenever we want by artificial means. Yeah, so I'm trying to put myself in the place of an ancient, perhaps one of many people who would worship the sun or revere the sun, and I would imagine that the first solar eclipse that they would have witnessed must have been a terrifying experience. So did it harbor fear, or was it a propitious event, or what would have gone through the mind of...
Well, we have some good written records on that, Ozzie. I know in the Maya world where I work, There is a document called the Dresden Codex, named after the library in Europe where it turned up in the janitor's trash heap in the 19th century, where you have omens that, based on the translations of the hieroglyphic writing, read, "Woe to the pregnant female, woe to the second sowing of maize." It's something unusual, something out of the ordinary, and that usually sets people off.
Right.
So the eclipse always was, at least to begin with, something to fear, something that arouses that feeling of fear. And I think even though we know in the modern era that we can control it, we know very well what causes an eclipse. Talk to anybody who has seen an eclipse, and you start with that feeling of fear, and then it turns into this passion. And I'm remembering a story on one of my eclipse trips when, at the end of totality, a young woman came to me. She'd just taken off her dark glasses that she'd used to look at the eclipse, and the tears were streaming down her face, and she said, "You may have talked about the science, but for me this was a miracle."
Right.
Miracle is not a word we use in science.
Right.
So I love exploring that world where science and religion kind of merge when it comes to human feelings. We tend to look at a lot of these myths as superstitions in our modern world, and it's a pity. There's an eclipse referred to by Andean people in the time of the Inca, after the conquest of the Inca, where people say that we have to make noise, we have to pound on drums, we have to beat our dogs to howl at the sun. And the chroniclers write of this, the Spanish ones, these people are superstitious, they don't know what they're talking about. The real story there is the myth says that the moon is whispering in the sun's ear. Can't you see him? There's the sun's ear,
Sure.
and the moon is whispering. He's telling people about the lies. He's lying to the sun about sins that people commit in the world here below during nighttime. And we're just trying to get the sun's attention to tell him that these are lies and they're not true. So that myth is not a superstition. It's about an occasion. The eclipse becomes an occasion to have a discourse about lying.
Right.
And that's something we could use today.
That's a beautiful story.
It's a true story.
You know, I think in many ways, contemporary religious people have lost touch with myth out of their search for need for literality or truth. So this is a way to keep in touch with myth now through science, which is really kind of a reversal of the way we normally think of things.
Well, that was one of the goals in writing the book, to talk
Sure.
about some of the eclipse myths and show that you really have to understand the culture to appreciate what the stories are about. You can't look at them from a non-cultural point of view and treat
Right.
them. You treat them as something that's strange or foreign or superstition, as we say.
So as to an ancient, would a total solar eclipse be a grand spectacle expressing essentially the same thing that the observance of winter solstice would express? That is, you're watching the sun go away or die and then reemerge and be reborn.
It's a good analogy, and I think you're absolutely right. In short time, in a short run, the same thing is happening. Light is being taken away,
Right.
and it returns. With the solstice, I ask my students, why do Christians celebrate the birth of Jesus as Christ on the winter solstice, which is the shortest day, the time when the sun is farthest to the south. And when we discuss this, they begin to realize that even though Jesus was not born at that time, he was born in August, I think the historians will say,
Right.
testify, that notwithstanding, this is the time when you need light to be brought in the world if you're a practicing Christian.
Right.
This is when you need to have the light, and of course, the Savior brings the light into the world. It's a marvelous co-optation of a Roman calendar,
Sure.
solar calendar, and that religious syncretism was responsible in part for the success, I think, of Christianity early on.
So we've talked a lot about eclipses, but as you adverted to earlier on, any kind of celestial event might raise the same kind of existential fear, particularly if it's not understood well. So are there other examples of events, either terrestrial natural disasters or celestial events that have led to end-of-world thinking or end-of-world
Sure.
anxieties?
Well, the comet that accompanied the death of Caesar, which it turns out, have occurred after Caesar, but who cares? You can make up the story. You know, there was an eclipse of the moon, 2 days after Princess Diana died. But you can take that eclipse and make it commensurate with the death and say that that's what it was. Nobody did that. But you had For example, the Lisbon earthquake in 1755 was a colossal event that promulgated a huge discussion about the end of the world. And out of that Lisbon earthquake came one of the first geologic explanations of the cause of earthquakes. So scientists revel in that. And they say, well, that was the first time we really started to understand earthquakes as natural events. Notwithstanding, it was something out of the ordinary, like a comet, like a supernova, something like an eclipse. And any time something happens out of the ordinary, it shakes you up.
Sure.
You know, oh, I missed my lunch. That's going to ruin my life. You know, I didn't get to sleep last night. Well, these are natural events that tend, these irregular occurrences tend to instill in us a feeling of fear, at least to begin with.
So is that something particular to the human psyche? I mean, is this the way we work? That we don't understand something and our immediate response is one of fear? Or
well,
anxiety?
I think here you'd have to ask a psychologist,
Sure.
wouldn't you? I wish we could talk to one. I'm not a psychologist. But I think it is human nature because we are regulated, I mean, with eclipses. Let's face it, it's a normal day-night cycle. Sometimes the days are longer, sometimes the nights are shorter, but still we're used to day-night periodicity. Along comes this event where all of a sudden at noon it gets dark, the stars come out, you see twilight all the way around the horizon, which you never see.
Right.
You see pinpoint images. The nose on your neighbor's face casts a sharp shadow on the cheek. You see scintillating crescents on the ground caused by the light passing through leaves in trees and the spaces between the leaves, and the wind is blowing and they shimmer 1,000 crescents.
Oh, my.
You see an avalanche of visual stimuli that throw you off. I mean, you can't think in a rational manner.
Right.
And I think that's the way it is with these wonders of nature. Now, of course, we can say, put on my astronomer's hat, we know very well what causes an eclipse. We know how to predict it. We know where it's going to be total and so on. Nothing to fear. Talk to somebody who's just seen a total eclipse, and if the word fear doesn't get included somewhere in the description
Right.
before it translates to awe, then that person wasn't looking.
Right. That's actually a beautiful description of what one might experience in an eclipse. Let me return to a group you mentioned earlier, the Millerites. A lot of people listening may not have heard of them, but they were one of these groups in the 19th century American cultural scene that believed fervently that the world was going to end. And as you said, William Miller actually put a date on it, I think maybe 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
Was there anything, obviously I think your thesis is fascinating, that the whole American experiment in some way is millenarian. So that's part of the cultural background of William Miller, but were there any other kind of natural events associating the hysteria surrounding the Millerites' predictions?
Well, there
about the
were, and by the way, I don't want to take credit for that theory. I think that theory is, of it being an American experience has been around,
Sure.
but I certainly subscribe to it. I looked at the newspapers at the time of these predictions made by Pastor Miller, who did this mathematically by looking at verses in the Bible, you know, this kind of mathomagic of the Bible, where a letter stands for a number and there's a code that you have to break. Kind of far-fetched idea in my view, but he took that idea and came to the conclusion that the world would come to an end. And first he said sometime in 1843, then he changed it and he pinpointed another date. And then when it didn't happen, he thought, well, maybe he made a mistake, and maybe what really is intended here is that it's sometime in the future. And it's out of that Seventh-day Adventism is born.
Right.
But there were, and I looked in the papers, there was the great eclipse of 1840, the comet of 1843, I'm sorry, the great comet of 1843, which had a tail that stretched 2/3 of the way across the sky, happened during that time, right at about the time he predicted it. And that was seized as one of the natural events that portended the impending doom. Another was a series of miraculous sunsets and hazes that occurred in the sky that came from forest fires that were occurring somewhere up in the Canadian maritime. So events like that, I don't know of any earthquakes, but certainly the Great Comet.
Right.
And there's a figure of that comet in the portrayal of that comet in my anxiety book. You always have to connect these predictions to something concrete.
Right.
There's got to be some concrete visual experience that we can see that incites us. Star of Bethlehem is another good example, that you had a visual phenomenon, and God knows hundreds of studies of what that star was, and needn't go into it. But the idea that if you're the Savior, you had better be accompanied by some colossal experience that happened that we can all see and all witness. Whether there was a star or not doesn't matter so much to me. It did when I was an astronomer. I don't know what the star of Bethlehem is. Make all the computation. The point is, it's about the story. It's what the Hebrew historians call it the midrash.
Sure.
You know, it's the story. Forget about the event. But we're so focused on getting the concrete event. Where was Noah's Ark exactly? What was the chemical composition of the burning bush?
Sure.
That's the answer we want.
So we're missing the point of the story if we get hung up on those details.
Exactly,
Right.
but that's what we want. We want a concrete answer. We want the takeaway, the bottom line, and we don't get it, I don't think.
I wonder what our next big apocalyptic event will be, or prediction. Will it come from one of these natural occurrences, or maybe, as you're suggesting, some things coming together, social, political, natural, religious, to produce
Well, I think in contemporary American politics, and I don't want to go into discussion of that, but somebody pointed out, and we just before this session with you, we had a panel discussion about this, and somebody brought up the notion in some quarters in popular American culture now that the end is near. This is the end, and we just better do away with the whole experiment.
Right.
Do away with it all is kind of an anarchistic notion, but destroy it all and we'll start over again. We'll destroy the establishment and just start over again. Now, I don't know if you need a celestial event to go with that. I don't think that maybe the August eclipse is so far off. I'll wager you there'll be a piece about that eclipse.
That'll be something that we can look for.
My prediction.
You're predicting that there will be predictions about the apocalypse associated with the eclipse. I would say you're probably exactly right. That's a theme, though, that you just touched on, both in the Mayans, in the Puritans, in the Book of Revelation. It's not just destruction. It's destruction and renewal, right? A new heaven and a new earth comes out of the apocalyptic drama.
Right, and it's not so different. I think the only difference with the Christian view is it's a teleological thing. It's kind of a time-running, events running like beads on a wire. If I could say in the American notion, that wire is inclined upward because we believe in the theory of progress. But then you get to the end, and then forever after you have eternal life if you do the right thing. Or you don't. I think with the Maya world, it's a cyclic renewal.
Right.
Although you can almost say, who cares about whether it's cyclic if the cycle is 5,200 years long, which it is. You can almost say that they're ironing out a loop of a cycle. You know, sort of the part that you see is like seeing the flat earth that we see around us.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about it sloping because it's so big. But I think the difference is that with the Maya, it's a renewal. It's not eternal life somewhere else in some other transcendent realm. It's here on earth, and we will make it better. In that sense, and this is an important point about Maya religion, their cosmology is participatory. The eschatology, if you will, is participatory. It's not, we are going to make it better. We're going to do that.
Well, this has been fascinating. I don't know many people who could take us on this journey from physics and astronomy through American history to the ancient Mayan civilizations. This has just been very interesting, and I do appreciate you joining us today. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Well, thank you, Ozzie, for having me on. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you
Thanks
so
much.
Well, that's it for this week. Thank you for joining us on Religion and Life. Next week, we're going to ask the question, is the Old Testament dying? Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.